Dystopian science fiction of the 1970s and 80s is kind of my thing, so it's a bit surprising that I had never watched Rollerball until it was requested here. What I and my tall glass of scotch found was a layered narrative that has a lot to say both as social commentary and as an artifact of its time. Rollerball is the story of Jonathan, the greatest of all time player in the game of rollerball. Imagine the bastard child of hockey and basketball played on a circular track with motorcycles. Jonathan is strongly encouraged to retire from the game. He refuses, and increasing pressure is brought to bear through a series of rule changes hoping to injure him and force him out. Until the game becomes so brutal that the track is riddled with dead bodies and flaming motorcycles while the spectators watch in horror as their blood sport gets a little too bloody. On the surface, it's a condemnation of contact sports and violence for entertainment, basically equating pro football with gladiatorial games. The film's director, Norman Jewison, has said things to that effect in interviews. But Rollerball works on a deeper level. Just as in our world, professional sports channel basic human tendencies like tribalism into avenues that are both profitable and non-threatening to the power structure, Rollerball has an explicit social function.
You know, how a game serves us has a definite social purpose. It's a significant game in a number of ways. The velocities of the ball, the awful physics of the track, in the middle of it all, men playing by an odd set of rules. It's not a game man is supposed to grow strong in, Jonathan. You appreciate that, don't you?
More and more, Mr. Bartholomew.
Think about it and understand it.
In this world, national governments have been replaced by a global council of executives.
Nations are bankrupt, gone. None of that tribal warfare anymore. Even the corporate wars are a thing of the past.
Business executives. The world is run like a for-profit corporation. They've solved issues like poverty and urban decay by monetizing everything. Everything is a tradable commodity, including people.
The corporation took my wife away because an executive wanted her.
I'm not going to review all that again. That was before I took over here, and I had nothing to do with it.
The whole big corporations run everything trope is a familiar one to us now. In Rollerball, we see the basic elements of the corporate state techno-dystopia that makes up the foundation of the cyberpunk of the 80s. But in 1975, cyberpunk wasn't ripe yet. Computers were either big mainframes owned by institutions, as Rollerball depicts with the central data core in Geneva, or expensive and limited kit builds like the Altair 8800 that were a long way from being user-friendly enough for widespread adoption. Side note, the kits did get much cheaper over the next few years. I was rocking a Sinclair ZX81 with a cassette deck for data storage. Rollerball came right at the end of that pre-PC era. 2 years later, the Apple II and the seemingly ubiquitous TRS-80 arrived on the consumer market, and things began changing rapidly from there. The arrival of practical personal computers in common use provided the missing piece dystopias like Rollerball needed to evolve into the cyberpunk techno-dystopias that we're familiar with today. There's a direct line connecting Rollerball, 80s cyberpunk, and the Matrix films. Both Neo in the Matrix and Rollerball's Jonathan discover that the world they live in isn't what they thought it was. But rather than a literal simulation, Rollerball shows us a system of social control based on a series of lies. Jonathan believed that his sport was about being the best, both as a team and as individual players. A free market of skill where the most capable get the most rewards, the most status. But the reality is something else.
The game was created to demonstrate the futility of individual effort. Let the game do its work.
The game of Rollerball is a microcosm of a society projecting an illusion of individual merit, a promise that hard work and talent lead to success. But it's a front to hide a collectivist reality that imposes order and stability at the expense of individual freedom. It's a world where people can be traded by the ruling class, where history is edited and falsified to fit the needs of the day. It's Orwell's 1984, pimped out with a stereo and leather seats. It's a system that some would wrongly call corporatist. I'm going to go all professor on you for a bit regarding use of the term corporatism. In modern English, corporatism or corporatist is generally used to mean benefiting big business, usually in a condemning way. It's also sometimes used as a synonym for fascist based on this quote attributed to Benito Mussolini. Some on the modern left have latched onto this: corporations influencing government equals corporatism equals fascism. Only, as near as I have been able to determine, Mussolini never said it. But Mussolini and other fascists did write extensively about what they called corporatism, not from the English corporation, but the Italian corporazione, or guild. Fascist ideology holds up the state as not only the supreme legal authority, but the spiritual and material embodiment of the collective people. These guilds, corporazione, are intended to give the state direct input from all facets of society. So the idea being that you don't need labor unions or political parties because these interests are already represented within the fascist state. This is why Mussolini called it totalitarian, nothing outside the state. It's a completely different concept from corporations as we understand them, which is a government-granted legal status to an organization, separating the finances and liability of that organization from the people making decisions for it. So, while Rollerball shows us a world owned by a cabal of mega-rich technocrats, it's not corporatism in any kind of fascist sense. It's also not capitalist. It's Neo-Feudalism. It's the totalitarianism not of ideology but of ownership. The 1% literally owning the world without the obfuscating layer of politics. Slap a code of paternalism on it and it becomes a socio-economic system. Which is, incidentally, the argument the Communist Party of China uses. The mandate of heaven to rule is respected as long as they deliver stability and economic growth.
All they want is a kind of incidental control of just a part of our lives. I mean, they have control economically and politically, but they also provide. You know they do.
Rollerball shows us a similar social system, one with many of the outward signs of capitalist excess, but structurally it's collectivist. Individuals are encouraged to contribute all they can to the society as a whole, but any individual rising too high above the median draws ire. At the macro level, this stifles the innovation that is the single biggest strength of capitalist economies and sends the society sliding into stagnation. On a more individual level, Jonathan becomes a megastar, the greatest player the game has ever seen, and in so doing, becomes an icon of individual merit that has to be publicly brought low. The people have to see that his greatness comes from his contribution to the team. The team wins games. The team is the champion. The role of the individual is not to excel and stand above, but to contribute to the success of the team. There's no I in team. There's no you in win. Anyway, Jonathan rebels against this system, but not in an ideologically motivated way. He's not some Marxist revolutionary or crusader for the rights of man. He's a proud man that just realized that he's essentially a prized horse and doesn't much like being a kept animal. His rebellion is personal, ultimately self-destructive, and while it doesn't bring down the corrupt system and usher in a new day of human progress, it does expose its lie in front of a vast audience of spectators who look on as one individual overcomes the obstacles put in his path by the oligarchs. It's the triumph of the individual over the system. The executives had to escalate when Jonathan refused their demands. Ultimately, they gave up incentives and coercion for what amounts to war. And like so often happens in war, the rules loosen as it drags on. Rollerball gives us an allegory of this escalation with the series of rule changes to rig the game against Jonathan and his team until ultimately the game degenerates into Kill Johnny and leaves the arena littered with corpses and motorcycles without accomplishing the policy goal of forcing him out of the game. The brutal, coercive nature of their society is laid bare for all in the arena and watching at home and in sports bars around the world to see. At the end, we're left wondering how many of those viewers will let what they saw fester in their minds and change their unthinking obedience, paving the way for real change, and how many will just consume next product like good little neo-serfs. Recording this stuff out in the woods by myself, I'm starting to feel like the Paul Harrell of nerddom.